Today we have an informative video, take 3 on this video, as at this point we are now doing this once a year, just to remind players, to inform players of this term you might be hearing whenever you jump in some WoW communities talking about the game. You might be hearing someone refer to a certain spec as being too good, or perhaps the opposite, as being quite bad, for the reason that it has very good or very bad scaling. You might hear this term being mentioned related to how a spec does, especially deeper down an expansion or deeper down a patch, doing better because of good scaling or doing worse because of bad scaling. So today I'm going to broadcast the TLDR of what exactly does this mean and why and when does this happen in-game to certain specs, and if it is still as relevant as it has been in the past compared to what we have nowadays in terms of scaling. So the general, most basic and simple description of scaling is how much power do you gain as a spec with your secondary and primary stat. You can read scaling as is good scaling being a spec that gains more than just what the base effect of the secondary stat you are gaining would do to you. Take critical strike, for example. If everyone has 50% crit, it means half the times you will do double damage. It's very simple. You are hitting for 1,000 and then you crit and you hit for 2,000. That's it. That's what crit does for everyone. But what if you are a Havoc Demon Hunter? What if you are a Havoc Demon Hunter with a talent known as Know Your Enemy? This talent says that you gain critical strike damage equal to 80% of your critical strike chance. This means that while everyone else, when they crit, they go from doing 1,000 to doing 2,000 damage because they do double damage, you as a Havoc Demon Hunter will be doing 2,400 damage. Because if you have 50% critical strike chance, like in this example, you are taking 80% of it, which is 40%, and you add that to your critical strike damage. So now your crits are not going to be doing 200% more damage like everyone else, they're going to be doing 240% more damage. This means that while everyone else gains simply double damage when they crit, you gain double damage and a little bit more, which gives you more value on your crit. When you start the patch, you start the season, you gain 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 item levels, and your critical strike chance goes higher and higher and higher. You, unlike some other specs, are going to benefit more from this secondary stat, meaning you scale well into the season. You can see this example in a 50-50 split of good and bad for something like Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shaman also has something, Elemental Fury, which gives them more critical strike damage, meaning for them, critical strike also gains more value. It's more powerful compared to your average specs. But they also have a downside, the downside of Lava Burst. Lava Burst will always critically strike if the target is affected by Flame Shock, which means gaining critical strike is not nearly as valuable because you don't need the critical strike rating to do most of your damage, which right now comes in the form of Lava Burst. This, for example, nets out to be a negative for the scaling of Elemental Shaman, because it nullifies, it weakens heavily the value of one of your secondary stats, in this case critical strike. Another good example, still staying in crit, is Mage. Fire Mage with critical mass, your spells have a 15% chance to deal a critical strike, and you gain more critical strike from all sources, 10% more. This makes the stat just naturally more valuable compared to any other spec that doesn't gain anything extra with crit. When you apply this logic to all of your stats, that's how you can extrapolate the value of a spec's scaling through a patch. How many of these talents, how many of these effects are going to gain more based on your secondary stats? Specs that have multiple interactions with your secondary stats, for example, specs that can proc something based on your ticks of the hots and dots, meaning that the more haste you have, the faster the dots and hots will tick, meaning the more chances you have to proc these effects. Those will scale well with haste, for example, more so than any other spec. Then you have mastery. Some specs will have good mastery because their mastery will take into account most of their damage or most of their healing. For example, back to our couple of specs we are looking at, Havoc Demon Hunter's mastery is doing more chaos damage. On top of that, they can also take any means necessary to now do even more chaos damage. So this mastery takes into account most of a Demon Hunter's damage. Compare this now to the current version of Elemental Shaman, where their mastery is significantly weaker. Mostly because, for example, it doesn't even account for your spenders. Luckily, nowadays, you don't even do that much damage with your spenders as an Elemental Shaman, but normally this would make you miss a decent portion of your damage, even if you were to stack a lot of mastery. So in general, mentioning a spec scaling well in an expansion is very simply referring to just how much value, how much extra value do they gain from secondary stats. Everyone that gets haste gets to cast faster, and their global cooldown gets faster. This is the same for everyone, and then there will be some specs that will gain something extra with haste. Maybe some chances to proc things, faster ticking dots, for example, or faster refreshing cooldowns that scale with haste, lower cooldowns on your abilities because you have haste, etc, etc. Those are all extra things that you can gain with haste. Same goes for crit. Everyone will go from doing 100% damage or healing to 200% damage or healing when they crit. But some specs, like the ones we mentioned here with Lava Burst, or the ones we mentioned here with something like Know Your Enemy, or the one for the mage with Critical Mass, they will gain something extra with Critical Strike. That is what makes you gain more value the more you go into an expansion. Why? Because you grow in item level, right? Remember the days when you hit max level and you have like 7% haste, 12% crit and 9% mastery. And then now at 485 item level, you have 35% crit, 30% haste and 60% mastery. Those bigger numbers are going to gain even more value if you gain something extra from those stats, not just the base effect that those stats give everyone by default. What needs to be mentioned though with scaling is that nowadays, of course, the value of these effects have gotten to be weaker. That's because of the, series of borrowed powers that Blizzard gave our specs over time. In Legion, it could have been something like legendaries having a very important effect on the scaling. Does it really matter as a rogue if you have poor scaling, if you can match Duskwalker's footpads with the mantle of the Master Assassin? That's what is going to give you your power in the patch, is what is going to give you a massive boost in damage in the patch, more so than the scaling. Same goes if you were a Shadow Priest in Legion, pairing together the Mother Shara's Seduction shoulders with the double Mind Blast Charge belt in Legion. Even when we go into BFA. In BFA, what could bail you out of having poor scaling were Azerite traits. The first patch, the first major patch with the Battle of the Zaralor raid, Shamans, for example, Elemental Shaman became super strong, top tier DPS spec, simply because they got Igneous Potential as an Azerite trait. Even Red Paladins became one of the best melee DPS in the raid because of things like Empyrean Power. That was also the beginning, for example, of the Glimmer of Light build of Holy Paladins because of the power given by this trait. It was also the beginning of abominations like the Fire Mage power in BFA with things like Blaster Master as an Azerite trait, and this continued, of course, into Shadowlands with Conduits, the classic example you can make for Shadowlands about how much less valuable can scaling be because Blizzard can just step in and give you power out of nowhere was Windwalker. Windwalker is traditionally mentioned as a spec with very poor scaling because their secondary stats don't really give them anything extra and their base scaling with those spells and talents and abilities is quite poor. Then you get into Shadowlands and they have conduits like Juan's Bond. They have conduits like Inner Fury or conduits like Coordinated Offensive and Calculated Strikes. These were all flat damage increases to many of their abilities, which essentially worked as a crutch scaling for the spec throughout the expansion, which effectively nullified the fact that the scaling of the spec was quite poor. Now, it is true that in Dragonflight we eventually gotten this level of borrowed power compared to these expansions we just mentioned. From Legion to BFA to Shadowlands, nowadays we don't really have that many things that are only going to last for a few months and then disappear in the next season. The only really borrowed power we are getting in this expansion is the tier set, which changes every season. So besides that, you're pretty much stuck with having to deal with the power of your own spec right now. If you don't have powerful scaling, it's not that something out of nowhere is going to come out and make you immediately powerful. But if you take into account the balance tuning that Blizzard will do before a release of a patch, and even inside the patch itself, we are seeing right now, for example, Fire Mage suddenly becoming more and more relevant in the season, mostly due to the continued buffs given by Blizzard, for example. It didn't really matter if the spec had good scaling or bad scaling in the patch, it was mostly just Blizzard's doing that made the spec more relevant. However, you can also see the other side of the coin in Windwalker. Because Windwalker also had very poor scaling and throughout its expansion became weaker and weaker, now they have gone through 3 different rounds of buffs given by Blizzard, to the point that now they are at the very least average after being buffed so much by Blizzard, for example. So while it is true that having scaling can help a spec remain or even grow more relevant inside a patch, it is still quite often in the hands of Blizzard whether or not they want to jump start a spec into becoming meta or into becoming powerful due to the balance tuning changes they want to give to the spec. We have taken away mostly the question mark of the borrowed powers, because it doesn't seem like Blizzard is going for that angle when it comes to character power anymore, compared to the previous expansions, but still from the balance tuning, the reworking of the specs, the reworking of some talent trees, it might still make room for some extra added scaling, extra added power given by each spec by Blizzard themselves. So even if it can still be relevant to be a spec with good scaling into an expansion, it can also still be impacted by Blizzard in multiple ways. So yes, you can still take into account whenever you hear the mentioning of certain specs having good scaling or certain specs having bad scaling deep into an expansion, just also take into account that this can still be modified somewhat easily by Blizzard's balance tuning. That's the take for today's recap on what exactly does scaling mean, and also how does this get affected by Blizzard's additions in the game throughout every patch or every balance tuning, etc, etc. So it is still relevant, it is still valuable to have good scaling as a spec, but in the end, we have seen before, and even now multiple times, the fact that often it won't matter nearly as much if Blizzard steps in and decides to single-handedly make a spec very powerful or weak because of nerfs, because of additions or removal of certain things that were making the spec powerful. So that was today's recap on the state of the meaning of scaling in this expansion in particular, compared to the previous expansions, hoping that now whenever you hear this term thrown around in discussions around WoW, around specs in the game, you have a better idea and a better understanding of what exactly does this refer to. So with this out of the way, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your mid-week boredom for today. We are starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I made it. I risked losing my voice about 6 times throughout the video, but we are there.